Good evening, drifters and dreamers. Tonight we're going to slip quietly through the gaslit fog of 19th century Britain, past the clatter of hansom cabs and the wheeze of coal-fired chimneys, into a world where nearly every ache, worry, and awkward supper conversation had a bottle waiting for it on the shelf. Tonight's journey is about the strange chemistry of Victorian daily life. The tonics, the powders, the sipping and doozing that quietly held an entire empire together. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Before you sink into your pillow, feel free to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, let the fan hum somewhere in the background and settle in. There's nowhere to be, nothing to solve, just a slow walk backward through history, one dusty apothecary bottle at a time. Let's begin with a question. Have you ever wondered what people did before self-care meant a jar of imported bath salts and a subscription app that reminds you to breathe? Before therapy appointments and electrolyte drinks and blackout curtains? The Victorians had their own version of all of it, and it usually came in a small glass bottle with a hand-lettered label promising something wildly optimistic. Relief for the nerves, comfort for the constitution, a cheerful disposition guaranteed, or your money back, so congratulations. You've just opened your eyes in a narrow terraced house in 1861, somewhere on the damp edge of a growing English city. Your head is heavy. A dog somewhere down the lane is barking at nothing in particular, and the apothecary 2 streets over already knows your name, your complaints, and precisely which bottle you'll ask for first. Let's start the day the way most households did, with a spoonful of something calming stirred into the morning tea. The morning draft. Picture your kitchen. The kettle is just beginning to sing on the hob, the wallpaper behind it faintly water-stained near the ceiling, and through the thin wall you can hear your neighbors already arguing about who was supposed to sweep the front step. On the table sits a small brown bottle, unremarkable in every way except for what's inside it. A rich, dark tincture made from poppy and spirit, sold under a dozen different flowery names depending on which chemist mixed it. This tincture is the great domestic peacekeeper of the age. A few drops in the tea for a restless husband. A few drops in the milk for a howling infant. A careful dose for grandmother's aching joints, and an even more careful dose for grandmother's opinions about the neighbors, which seem to soften considerably after the second cup. Doctors prescribe it liberally for coughs, for toothaches, for what the ladies' magazines vaguely call a delicate constitution, and for what everyone privately understands to mean a marriage that isn't going particularly well. It is, in its own strange way, the aspirin, the sleeping pill, and the mood stabilizer of its century, all bottled together and sold without a second thought. You take your first spoonful, and the morning softens at the edges. The looming rent payment seems slightly less urgent. The smell of boiling cabbage from 3 houses down becomes almost bearable. Even the pigeon perched stubbornly on your windowsill seems, for a moment, like a rather profound philosopher. Of course, nobody talks much about what happens after weeks and months of these mornings. The slowed thoughts, the strange, syrupy quality that begins to color every hour of the day. The way an entire household can drift through its chores in a fog nobody quite names. But the bottle sits on the mantel, refilled every few weeks without question, as ordinary and unremarkable as the teapot beside it. The cellar room as the evening thickens into night. Let's follow a different kind of Victorian ritual, one conducted not in the parlor, but down a narrow stair, behind a curtained doorway, in a room thick with smoke and a strange, sweetish haze. You duck beneath a low beam, and the noise of the street disappears behind you. The air inside is heavy, a mixture of burning oil, old velvet, and something faintly medicinal that seems to cling to the walls themselves. Low couches line the room, each occupied by a figure in some state between waking and dreaming. A sailor here, a clerk there, a gentleman who, judging by his coat, has clearly wandered rather far from his usual circles. Someone hands you a long, slender pipe. The ritual takes patience. A small dark pellet warmed carefully over a flame until it softens, then drawn slowly through the stem. The first breath is bitter and sharp, but what follows is an extraordinary spreading calm, as though your bones themselves had been wrapped in warm wool. Conversation here is rare and unnecessary. Nobody is comparing family lineage or debating the price of coal. Instead, there's a companionable silence, broken only by the occasional soft laugh, the hiss of a match, the creak of a floorboard as the room's keeper moves quietly between the couches, refilling pipes and making sure no one has set their own sleeve on fire. Hours drift by unmeasured. Someone stirs, gathers their hat, usually the wrong one, and stumbles back out into the fog. You tell yourself you'll never return. You will, of course, be back within the week. It's cheaper than a holiday, after all, and considerably more atmospheric than the sitting room. The chemist's wonder powder by late morning the next day. Your tooth has begun to throb with real conviction, and there is exactly one place in town equipped to handle it without the indignity of screaming. The dentist's chair, freshly stocked with a small white powder that has, within the space of a few short years, become an absolute sensation. You've heard the claims already, that a dab of this powder along the gums banishes pain entirely, banishes fatigue, banishes shyness at parties, banishes practically everything except your own common sense. The dentist applies a small amount, and within moments your jaw goes pleasantly numb, your heartbeat quickens just slightly, and the extraction that follows feels almost like something happening to somebody else, somewhere far away, in a much less interesting century. It doesn't end at the dentist's door. This same powder finds its way into tonics for melancholy, drops for exhaustion, and lozenges marketed directly to mountain climbers, lecturers, and anyone facing a particularly long evening of small talk. Advertisements promise it will banish every trace of fatigue and restore vigor to even the most listless of constitutions. Whether that's medicine or simply very confident marketing is, admittedly, difficult to say. You notice, over the following weeks, a curious pattern among your acquaintances. A sudden burst of energy at tea time. An overwhelming urge to reorganize the entire linen cupboard at 2 in the morning. An inability to stop discussing one's plans for inventing a self-winding pocket watch. The family listens, mostly out of politeness. The sleeping draft sleep in a 19th century city is its own kind of battle. Above the noise of hooves on cobblestone, the shouts of costermongers, and a neighbor's late-night violin practice that seems to grow more enthusiastic the later it gets, rest becomes something you have to fight for. Enter a new chemical marvel, a clear, faintly sweet liquid that chemists proudly call the first truly reliable sedative of the modern age. A spoonful stirred into water before bed, and within minutes the noise of the street begins to recede, blurring into a soft, distant hum, as though the whole city had been wrapped in cotton wool. It becomes a fixture on bedside tables from the grandest townhouses to the humblest boarding rooms. Your neighbor swears by it to sleep through her husband's snoring. Your brother-in-law takes a dose before important meetings, convinced that 8 hours of chemically assisted rest is the true secret to confidence. Even the household dog gets the occasional taste, mixed into his supper to stop him howling at passing carriages. Waking the next morning carries its own particular fog, a heaviness behind the eyes, a sense of having dreamed something you can no longer quite recall. But in a city that never truly quiets down, the ability to sleep through a parade, 2 domestic arguments, and an unannounced visit from a talkative aunt is not something anyone complains about. The nursery bottle. Nothing tests the patience of a Victorian household quite like a teething infant at 3 in the morning. The floorboards creak under packing feet, the whole house is awake, and somewhere down the hall a grey-tant is muttering about how, in her day, Bobby simply learned to be quiet. Into this chaos steps a small glass bottle, sweet-smelling and syrupy, marketed directly to exhausted parents with the gentlest possible name, something like a soothing cordial or a quieting syrup. The label promises relief from teething, from colic, from the vague and mysterious complaints that afflict infants in every century. What it doesn't advertise quite so plainly is the generous helping of poppy extract folded into every spoonful. One dose, carefully measured, or more honestly, eyeballed by a bleary-eyed parent at 3:30, and the wailing stops almost immediately. The whole house exhales. Grandmothers pass the recipe down like a family heirloom, along with tips on how to make the effect last comfortably through a long Sunday church service. Pharmacists nod approvingly. Doctors rarely object. The syrup becomes such a fixture of nursery life that entire advertising campaigns are built around rosy-cheeked infants sleeping peacefully in their mother's arms, with no mention whatsoever of what an accidental double dose might mean. That, everyone silently agrees, is a worry best left for the next generation to sort out. For now, there is only blessed, glorious quiet. The baby sleeps. The parents collapse into their chairs by the fire, unsure whether to feel triumphant or faintly uneasy, and mostly settle on triumphant because sleep is sleep, and questions can wait until morning. An evening of vapors. Let's step now into a rather different sort of gathering. A fashionable evening party, the kind with tepid punch, overly enthusiastic dancing, and at least one guest determined to retell the story of his cousin's railway mishap for the third time this month. In the conservatory, away from the noise, your hostess keeps a small glass bottle of a sharp-smelling volatile liquid, ostensibly reserved for medical emergencies. Unofficially, it has become the evening's real entertainment. A handkerchief is produced, dabbed generously, and passed hand to hand with a knowing look. You inhale, half expecting nothing more than a slight dizziness. Instead, the walls seem to soften and blur, your knees go pleasantly wobbly, and everything, absolutely everything, becomes wildly funny. The flowers on the side table appear to be having a private conversation. Your aunt's laugh sounds like a kettle coming to a boil underwater. You sink into the nearest chaise, giggling helplessly among a small crowd of new best friends whose names you will not remember by breakfast. This same vapor has a far more serious reputation in the operating theater, where surgeons have discovered that a patient rendered peacefully unconscious is a far easier patient to work on than one thrashing and shouting. Before its arrival, surgery was a brutal test of endurance, survived with nothing more than a stiff drink and several strong assistants holding you down. Now, at least, you drift off to nothing, blissfully unaware of whatever improvements are being made. Back at the party, of course, things are considerably less clinical. Medical students have discovered its recreational charms with great enthusiasm, turning chemistry lectures into an exercise in barely controlled hysteria. University common rooms host informal contests over who can hold their breath the longest before dissolving into laughter. Whoever loses faints. Whoever wins also faints, but with considerably more style. The morning after tends to be less glamorous. A headache, a missing hat, a vague memory of declaring undying devotion to somebody's spaniel. But for one evening, the ordinary Victorian gathering becomes something closer to genuine joy. The gin house. Not every remedy for a hard day comes with a doctor's blessing. Down a narrow, puddled alley, past a butcher's shuttered stall and a lamplighter making his rounds, sits a gin house, cheap, loud, and permanently full. You duck inside. The air is thick with the smell of juniper and unwashed wool, and the noise is a constant low roar of complaint, laughter, and the occasional heated argument about football, wages, or the unfairness of the world in general. The bartender pours without being asked twice, sliding a chipped glass across the counter with the weary efficiency of a man who has heard every excuse in the book and stopped listening to most of them. It burns going down, and then, almost immediately, the evening feels a little more bearable. Your rent is still overdue. Your boots are still wet. But for the moment, none of that seems quite so pressing. Around you, an entire cross-section of the city has gathered to forget its troubles together: dockworkers, seamstresses, a retired soldier nursing something stronger than his pension can really afford. This particular drink earns itself a rather unflattering nickname among reformers and preachers, who blame it for half the city's misfortunes. The government tries, periodically, to crack down, raising taxes and tightening licenses. The people simply find new recipes, new backroom stills, new ways of turning grain and potato peelings into something worth drinking. The morning after is predictable, a pounding head, a dry mouth, a stomach staging its own quiet rebellion. The cure, naturally, is more of the same. It becomes less a solution than a way of life, passed from one hard week to the next, a small and stubborn form of comfort in a city that rarely slows down long enough to notice anyone's suffering. The High Street Gamble. Daylight brings you back to more respectable business. A walk down the high street, past the milliner and the bakery, toward the chemist's shop, where an entire wall of colorful bottles waits to solve whatever ails you, real or imagined. Shopping for medicine here is less a careful decision and more a small act of faith. The labels promise everything and specify almost nothing. One bottle claims to invigorate the liver. Another promises to restore lost vitality. A third, rather ominously, simply reads for general debility, which could mean anything from a mild cold to a full existential crisis. Most of these tonics share a cheerful family resemblance, a good dose of sugar, a splash of alcohol, and more often than not, a discreet helping of something considerably stronger tucked quietly into the recipe. Nobody asks too many questions. The chemist, mustache impeccably groomed, wraps your purchase in brown paper with the confident air of a man who has never once doubted his own wares. You take it home, dose yourself according to instructions that manage to be both extremely specific and entirely useless, and wait. Sometimes there's genuine relief. Sometimes there's simply a strange tingling in your fingertips and a newfound interest in reorganizing your bookshelf. Either way, there's always another bottle waiting on the shelf next week, wrapped in equally confident brown paper. The pale and powdered face. Fashion in this era has decided, quite firmly, that a healthy glow belongs to farm laborers and children, not to anyone of genuine refinement. What you want, if you're attending tonight's ball, is a complexion so pale it borders on ghostly, suggesting a life spent entirely indoors, fainting delicately at intervals. To achieve this look, a small decorative box sits on your dressing table, containing what appear to be delicate little wafers. They are, in fact, laced with a very small and very dangerous dose of a well-known poison, marketed with a straight face as the latest advancement in continental beauty science. You take one, half expecting some dramatic reaction, and feel instead only a small, smug glow of accomplishment. You are, for the moment, both fashionable and still very much alive. The rest of tonight's routine follows the same logic: a dusting of face powder containing lead, a touch of cream containing mercury, and a few drops of a plant-based tincture designed to make your pupils appear large and dramatically wide. At the ball, you are, by every account, radiant. Other guests whisper admiringly about your complexion, unaware of its rather alarming origins. There are whispers, too, of occasional fainting spells among the most devoted followers of this particular beauty regimen, and rumors that the local undertaker can spot a habitual user by a faint greenish tinge that develops over time. But these rumors are easily dismissed as the complaints of people who simply don't understand true elegance. The green hour. As the night deepens, a different crowd gathers in a dimly lit cafe: poets, painters, and a handful of people who claim, with great confidence, to have invented entirely new forms of punctuation. Everyone here is chasing the same thing: a glimpse of inspiration, bottled in brilliant emerald green. The ritual is almost ceremonial. A glass of the pale green liquid is set before you, a slotted spoon balanced across the rim, a small cube of sugar perched on top. Cold water trickles slowly over the sugar, clouding the liquid into a swirling, opalescent mist. The whole table watches this transformation with the reverence usually reserved for church. The first sip carries a sharp taste of licorice and herbs, followed by a strange, spreading warmth. Around you, conversation drifts between brilliant inspiration and utter nonsense, and it becomes increasingly difficult to tell which is which. Someone sketches furiously on a napkin, certain they've captured the very essence of time itself. Someone else is deep in earnest debate with an empty chair. This drink has earned a reputation for unlocking creativity and dissolving the usual boundaries of polite behavior, along with rather more serious warnings from doctors about hallucinations and instability. For many in this room, though, it's simply a cheaper, stronger way to soften the edges of a long, cold night in a city that never quite settles down. When the evening finally ends, you step back out into the fog with your head full of half-finished poetry and someone else's shoes, feeling, for a little while, gloriously connected to something larger than yourself. The family sitting room. Some evenings call for nothing more dramatic than surviving a long conversation with relatives. You're settled into a creaky armchair while your aunt recounts, for what feels like the 100th time, the story of her trip to the coast some 20 years back. Polite coughing hasn't worked. Staring meaningfully at the clock hasn't worked. But tucked in your waistcoat pocket is a small bottle from the chemist, labeled simply as a tincture for all that ails thee. A gentle preparation made from a certain fragrant plant, sold as respectably as any cough syrup. Doctors prescribe it for nerves, for muscle aches, for the vague catch-all diagnosis of female troubles, and it comes recommended by physicians who, as far as anyone can tell, mostly just enjoy the sound of the word tincture. A spoonful, neat or stirred into tea, and your shoulders begin to loosen. The piano music drifting from the next room suddenly sounds almost pleasant. Your aunt's story about a stubborn donkey and a disagreement with a crab takes on an unexpected charm. It's popular among the more artistic and well-to-do circles. Poets swear it unlocks new realms of thought. Painters claim it deepens their appreciation of color. And your cousin, who has been working on the same novel for the better part of 6 years, credits it for every one of the 9 pages he's managed so far. Nobody calls it anything scandalous. It's simply elevating the Constitution, which sounds a great deal more respectable than the truth. Too much, though, and you might find yourself reorganizing the mantelpiece ornaments for a solid hour, convinced that symmetry holds the secret to lasting happiness, or wandering into the garden and forgetting entirely why you went there. Still, you make it through family hour with your sanity mostly intact, and perhaps even a touch more fondness for your aunt's endless stories than you had at the start of the evening. The vitality drops. Later that week, you're feeling what the local doctors call a case of the vapors, tired, unsteady, generally out of sorts. Your friend recommends the most invigorating tonic on the chemist's shelf, and the pharmacist hands it over with the cheerful confidence of a man entirely unbothered by the small skull printed near the corner of the label, which he insists is purely decorative. This particular remedy is derived from the seeds of a certain tree, and in careful, minuscule doses, it's said to sharpen the senses and steady the heart. Doctors recommend it for fatigue, for a sluggish constitution, for anything requiring a bit of extra determination. Long-distance runners are known to take a dose mid-race to keep themselves upright for the final stretch, a practice that occasionally results in a rather dramatic collapse at the finish line, twitching with what onlookers generously describe as enthusiasm. You mix a careful drop into a glass of water, brace yourself against the bitter, metallic taste, and feel your pulse quicken almost immediately. The city's smog looks a shade less gray. Your neighbor's violin practice becomes, briefly, almost tolerable. It's popular at dinner parties, where guests compare doses over tea the way modern people might compare their morning coffee order, each one boasting quietly about how little sleep they need these days. Of course, the same substance has a rather dramatic reputation in the pages of popular mystery novels, where a few drops slipped into the wrong teacup make for an excellent plot twist. Nobody dwells on this too much. In an age where most remedies come with more risk than benefit, a little danger is simply considered part of the charm. The gentle cough remedy. Winter brings its usual chorus of coughing, sniffling, and general misery, and for that there is, conveniently, an entire industry of soothing lozenges, small, sweet, and quietly loaded with a comforting dose of poppy extract. Children adore them. Why wouldn't they? An entire classroom can go suspiciously quiet after a single round passed out during morning recess. Parents keep a tin close at hand for any occasion involving coughing, sneezing, or simply speaking out of turn at the dinner table. The local vicar is rumored to keep a stash tucked into his pulpit, ensuring Sunday sermons proceed in a tone both measured and unusually unhurried. The advertisements feature beaming, rosy-cheeked children holding hands around a piano, with absolutely no mention of what regular use might mean for a small, developing constitution. And yet, in fairness, they work remarkably well. The tickle in your throat fades, the headache lifts, the whole afternoon takes on a soft, dreamlike quality, as though the edges of the world had been gently rounded off. Moderation, admittedly, is not the era's strongest quality, and there are whispers of children who enjoyed their cough drops rather too enthusiastically and slept clean through the holidays. But for now, comfort wins out over caution, one sweet, hazy dose at a time. Medicine by the glass. If you're feeling under the weather in the mornings, and honestly, who isn't, your physician has a remarkably consistent prescription. A small glass of something fortifying, brandy to start the digestion, a glass of port with lunch, a finger of whiskey before bed to keep the damp night air at bay. It's not considered indulgence. It's considered medicine, prescribed with the same confidence as any tonic on the chemist's shelf. Children receive a warm, sweetened toddy for their coughs. The elderly sip cordials for their joints. Your grandfather insists that his daily glass is the sole reason he's outlived 3 doctors and 1 particularly stubborn goat. Every social occasion comes lubricated accordingly. Sherry at funerals, brandy at weddings, punch at practically everything in between. Nobody mentions hangovers, or the faint dizziness, or the sudden urge to lecture total strangers about the restorative powers of a good wine. If you overindulge, you simply blame the doctor's orders and attempt a dignified, sideways route up the staircase. There's an unspoken agreement across the whole of society that nobody will judge too harshly, because, as it happens, nearly everyone is in the same pleasantly tipsy boat. The silver pill. For anything involving the stomach, and in an era of questionable food and worse water, that covers quite a lot. There's a small, shining pill waiting in the medicine cabinet, made from a very particular liquid metal that most people today would never dream of swallowing. It's recommended for constipation, for headaches, for aching joints, and for a long list of more serious ailments besides. Doctors hand it out with total confidence, and if the first dose doesn't help, the solution is simply to take more. The side effects, a strange metallic taste, trembling hands, occasional excessive drooling politely referred to as salivation, are treated as a minor inconvenience. A small price for relief. At tea, friends compare symptoms the way people today might compare vitamin regimens. Still a bit shaky, someone might say, but my joints have never felt better. Nobody quite connects the dots, and the local undertaker, as it happens, is rumored to be a rather loyal customer of the same chemist. The smoking room. Step outside, and the entire street seems to exhale a fine haze of tobacco smoke, mixing with the coal smog until the sky itself takes on a permanently beige tint. Smoking here isn't so much a vice as a shared ritual. Pipes in the parlor after dinner, hand-rolled cigarettes among the artistic set, a pinch of snuff passed discreetly at the theater. There's real ceremony to it. Gentlemen retreat after supper to compare tobacco blends and tell long, winding stories. A pinch of snuff produces a dramatic, synchronized sneeze that somehow counts as good manners. Nobody worries much about the health of their lungs. Persistent coughing is blamed on drafts, damp weather, or simply a lack of proper Victorian fortitude. If the cough won't quit, the solution, naturally, is to add a small tot of whiskey and hope for the best. The quieting mixture. By evening, your nerves are, as everyone likes to say, quite undone between factory whistles, a scolding at work and the neighbor's violin. It's been an exhausting day. The chemist's answer is a pale blue bottle, a mild sedative mixture recommended for restlessness, agitation, and what's politely called a nervous temperament. One spoonful in water, repeated as needed, and a heavy calm settles over the evening. Your worries about money or the future or the strange sound coming from behind the coal scuttle drift quietly away. Doctors love it for its sheer versatility. Moody teenagers, overly enthusiastic husbands, anxious cooks nervous about a new oven, all find their way to the same blue bottle. Take too much, and the world grows a little too peaceful, leaving you staring out the window for the better part of an hour, wondering why your neighbor owns quite so many hats. The productive wine. There's always more to do than hours in the day allow, letters to write, ledgers to balance, a household to keep in order. For exactly this problem, there exists a rich, dark wine infused with a healthy dose of coca leaf extract, imported with great fanfare and endorsed, according to the advertisements, by popes, presidents, and at least one famous inventor who swears it helps him think faster and sleep less. You pour a modest glass before tackling your chores and feel the effect almost immediately. A bright, buzzing optimism. A sudden conviction that you could conquer not just your to-do list, but possibly a small nation as well. The dusting gets done twice, just to be thorough. Letters multiply. Your cousin finishes her wedding quilt in record time and immediately starts a second one for no particular reason. It's prescribed by physicians for fatigue, for anemia, for the vague and fashionable diagnosis of overwork, which in practice simply means being a functioning adult in an industrial city. Social gatherings transform under its influence. Book clubs debate 4 novels simultaneously. Charity committees plan 3 fundraisers at once, and everyone leaves feeling as though they've accomplished the work of an entire month in a single afternoon. The trouble comes later, of course. Sleep becomes a distant memory. Your heart flutters unpredictably, and by 3 in the morning you're wide awake, wondering why you've alphabetized the spice rack and drafted a lengthy essay on umbrella etiquette. Still, in the moment, nothing feels impossible, and that feeling, however brief, is worth quite a lot to a household with more chores than hours. A handkerchief and a chair. For anything requiring genuine pain relief, a bad tooth, a broken bone, a surgery too dreadful to imagine while fully conscious, there is a small brown bottle of clear, sharp-smelling liquid that has utterly transformed what it means to see a doctor. The ritual is simple. You recline in the chair, a folded cloth is pressed gently over your nose and mouth, and a few careful drops are added. Within moments, a cool, spreading numbness rises up from your toes, sounds grow distant and soft, and the world dissolves into something like a pleasant, floating dream. Surgeons adore it. Patients who once thrashed and screamed now lie peacefully still, allowing procedures that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. It escapes the operating theater quickly enough, finding its way into ordinary households as a cure for restlessness, insomnia, and if the rumors are to be believed, the occasional overly persistent house guest. Doozing, admittedly, is more art than science. Too little and you're left merely damp-faced and irritated. Too much, and there are stories of people waking days later in an entirely different town, missing a shoe and several memories. Despite the risks, it remains a fixture of the medicine cabinet, a quick, blissful shortcut to oblivion when the pain of the day grows too sharp to bear otherwise. The steam room. Sometimes the answer isn't another bottle at all, but simply heat, steam, and a very small towel. The public bathhouse is one of the era's great equalizers. Dukes and clerks alike reduced to red-faced, towel-wrapped figures, sweating out the week's troubles side by side on long tiled benches. The air is thick with eucalyptus and quiet conversation, broken occasionally by a philosophical sigh from somewhere in the fog. An attendant, part therapist and part drill sergeant, insists that relaxation is simply a matter of surrendering to the heat. Someone hands you a cup of water flavored faintly with lemon or mint, or, if the rumors are true, something a little stronger, discreetly added for a small extra fee. There's a cold plunge pool at the end of the ritual, greeted with gasps, shouts, and the occasional creative profanity as the brave and the foolish leap in together. You emerge afterward lighter, calmer, thoroughly damp, and reasonably convinced you could nap standing up. It isn't a miracle cure, but it's about as close to genuine wellness as the era tends to get. No bottle required, just steam, patience, and a willingness to sweat out the week. Grandmother's cabinet. Not every remedy comes from the chemist. Sometimes it comes from the kitchen, applied with brisk confidence by whichever grandmother happens to be in charge that evening. A chest cold calls for a mustard plaster, a stinging paste of mustard powder and flour bound to the skin with a cloth, on the theory that if the discomfort moves from your lungs to your chest, progress has clearly been made. A headache calls for a dab of camphor beneath the nose, sharp and bracing enough to clear your sinuses and possibly your entire sense of the passage of time. A stubborn cough calls for goose fat, rubbed generously onto the chest, or, in truly determined households, stirred into warm milk. Nobody can quite explain why any of it works, but since grandmother has made it to 90 through exactly this regimen, nobody's inclined to argue. There's comfort in the ritual itself, the fussing, the warm brick tucked at the foot of the bed, the firm instruction never to go out with wet feet lest you catch your death. The remedies may or may not do much for the actual illness, but they do a great deal for the feeling of being cared for, which, as any grandmother will tell you, is half the cure anyway. A bottle of mystery. Back at the chemist's shop, the shelves seem to multiply weekly, each bottle promising something bolder than the last. You select one at random, a liver tonic with a suspiciously confident sheep printed on the label, and the chemist nods approvingly, as though you've won some sort of prize. The ingredients are listed in the vaguest possible terms: restorative botanicals, vital essences, a proprietary blend known only to the doctor whose name graces the bottle. You take it home, dose yourself according to instructions that manage to say everything and nothing at once, and wait to see what happens. Sometimes there's real relief. Sometimes there's simply a strange tingling and a newfound interest in reciting poetry to the cat. Friends trade their own discoveries at tea. One swears by a tonic that smells faintly of turpentine and regret. Another insists a certain nerve restorer cured her gout entirely, though she can now only speak in rhyme. Nobody minds the uncertainty much. In a city of relentless fog and repetition, a little unpredictable chemistry is, if nothing else, a decent story to tell at the next dinner party. The morning after. Sunrise brings the inevitable reckoning, a pounding head, a dry mouth, and only the haziest memory of the previous evening's enthusiastic debate about arsenic face powder. The solution, naturally, is a trip back to the very same chemist who caused the trouble in the first place. He reaches beneath the counter without needing to ask what's wrong, producing his most popular remedies for exactly this situation. One bottle for the headache, another for the shakes, and perhaps a third to steady the nerves after last night's spontaneous promise to host next week's dinner party. The cycle repeats itself with cheerful regularity. Regret in the morning, resolve by noon, and a full relapse by evening, shared good-naturedly among friends who are all, in their own way, riding out the exact same wave. The railway carriage. Travel by train brings its own peculiar customs. Before the engine has even left the station, an announcement rings through the carriage. The refreshment car is open. Passengers rise as one, clutching tickets and appetites, toward a menu built almost entirely around sherry, port, and weak tea, with sandwiches serving mainly as decoration. By the second stop, strangers have become fast friends, cards have appeared from somewhere, and a bearded gentleman is reciting poetry with steadily increasing enthusiasm. The train rocks gently around a bend, tea spills, everyone laughs, and somebody starts up a folk song that half the carriage seems to know the words to. Even the engineer, it's rumored, enjoys a small tot of brandy before returning to his post, an arrangement everyone finds perfectly reasonable in an age without much in the way of official oversight. You arrive at your destination pleasantly tipsy, a little unsteady, and thoroughly convinced you've made several lifelong friends whose names you can no longer quite recall. The tracks, at least, run straight. The stories collected along the way rarely do. The sweet shop. For the children who spend their days minding younger siblings, running errands, or working long hours in service, a visit to the corner sweet shop is one of the week's few real pleasures. The shelves are bright with striped sticks, chewy toffees, and jars of lozenges in every color, and tucked among the ordinary sweets are a few with a little something extra folded into the recipe. A cough calls for a soothing lozenge, lightly dosed with a comforting extract. A tantrum calls for a quieting toffee, mild enough to be given without a second thought. A restless night in a cold room calls for a spoonful of syrup before bed, marketed under names cheerful enough to sound harmless: a nurse's helper, a mother's little comfort, a child's peaceful drop. Parents keep a tin on hand the way modern households might keep a jar of vitamins, reaching for it at the first sign of fussiness. Teachers, too, are known to keep a small stash in their desk drawers for particularly fidgety pupils. The results are, by most accounts, remarkably effective: a house full of drowsy, agreeable children, sleeping soundly through the night without complaint. Nobody keeps close track of side effects. A little extra sleepiness, an occasional dreamy afternoon spent staring at nothing in particular, small prices, it seems, for a household finally at peace. Every so often there's a story of a child who built up quite a tolerance and spent an entire afternoon rearranging the furniture or teaching the family cat an entirely new trick. But even they eventually drift off, sticky-chinned and smiling, into a long and peaceful sleep. The electric chair. Science in this era feels like magic, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the newest craze sweeping fashionable health spas: electrotherapy. The promise is simple and thrilling: a mild electric current, applied directly to the body, said to restore vitality, cure exhaustion, and banish whatever vague ailment happens to be troubling you that week. You settle into a chair wired with an assortment of dials, paddles, and wires that look suspiciously improvised. The practitioner, whose expertise seems to come largely from enthusiasm rather than formal training, assures you that everything is perfectly safe, provided you don't touch anything metal that isn't already attached to the machine. A dial is turned. A current pulses gently through your arms and legs. You twitch, tingle, and feel, against all logic, rather invigorated. Advertisements promise instant rejuvenation, endorsed by mustachioed gentlemen radiating confidence and, presumably, a great deal of static electricity. Parties are built around the machines, friends daring one another to turn the dial higher, laughing as their hair stands on end, comparing whose limb has gone most thoroughly numb. Skeptics grumble that it's all nonsense, pointing out that most patients leave with nothing more than improved posture and a mild sense of alarm. But for one evening, at least, it makes for a wonderfully electric distraction from the usual routine. Taking the waters. For those who can afford a longer escape, there are the famous spa towns, grand, damp, and thoroughly convinced of their own healing powers. Visitors arrive in their finest clothes, ready for a schedule of drinking, soaking, and gentle walking, all built around the supposedly miraculous properties of the local mineral springs. The ritual begins with a glass of warm, faintly sulfurous water, guaranteed to cure everything from rheumatism to heartbreak. The taste is, without exception, dreadful, salty, metallic, and lingering in a way that makes conversation afterward rather difficult. Everyone drinks it anyway, nodding solemnly at its supposed benefits while quietly calculating the distance to the nearest washroom. The communal baths that follow are grand affairs, tiled in blue and white, filled with steam and the murmured conversation of strangers in every stage of undress, comparing ailments and swapping rumors about miraculous recoveries. Evenings are spent promenading along the town's gardens, striking up friendships and romances over shared discomfort, the whole town united by a strange, damp camaraderie. Whether or not anyone actually leaves cured is almost beside the point. Everyone leaves, at least, with a good story and a healthy respect for fresh air. A quiet reflection. And so another long day in this foggy, bustling century draws to its close. You've sampled the tonics, endured the powders, and survived at least one exceedingly confident piece of medical advice involving a small dose of poison for your complexion. Perhaps you took a spoonful of something calming for your nerves this morning, and a glass of something fortifying this evening, and somewhere in between wondered, not for the first time, whether any of it actually helped, or whether it was simply nice to believe it did. As you settle now into bed, wrapped in blankets that owe nothing to opium or mercury, take a quiet moment to appreciate the small, unglamorous comforts of modern life. Clean water, painkillers that don't double as poison, and the fact that nobody's well-meaning grandmother is likely to offer you cocaine drops for a cough. It's easy from a comfortable distance to smile at how strange it all sounds, but behind every peculiar remedy was simply a person trying to get through an ordinary day, tired, aching, hopeful, doing the best they could with what science and superstition had to offer them at the time. They were stubborn. They were resourceful. They were, more often than not, a little bit ridiculous. And in their own strange, chemical way, they carried an entire century forward on nothing more than hope, habit, and whatever happened to be sitting on the chemist's shelf that week. So rest easy tonight in your quiet, ordinary comfort. Let the fog of that old century settle behind you, and let your own dreams, free of green fairies, mercury shine, and mysterious botanical essences, carry you gently into a peaceful, well-earned sleep. Good night.